In the small, quiet town of Redding, located in Northern California, life has always flowed smoothly and calmly. The residents knew each other by sight, and not a single event, whether joyful or sad, passed the attention of the neighbors. In this cozy, seemingly safe corner, an unexpected discovery shocked everyone to the core. One cool summer evening, as the sun was setting, Martha Green, an old neighbor, was walking her dog along a quiet street. She often passed by the White House, where 16-year-old Jenny lived with her grandfather Harold. Martha always smiled when she saw them gardening, or when they sat together on the veranda, discussing something in a quiet voice. It seemed that warmth and mutual respect reigned in their relationship, but this evening everything was different. At first, Martha noticed that the gate to the garden was slightly open, although Harold always carefully locked it. She found it strange, but she chalked it up to forgetfulness. However, Martha's dog, usually calm and obedient, suddenly began to behave restlessly. He growled and pulled the owner towards the bushes in the Whites' backyard. Martha's heart sank in alarm. She followed the dog, and what she saw changed her life forever. Among the dense bushes, only slightly covered, lay Jenny. Her body was unnaturally stiff, and her face was pale and lifeless. Next to her, in the ground, a deep mark was torn out, as if someone had tried to bury something heavy, but left the work unfinished. Martha screamed. Her scream cut through the silence, instantly attracting the attention of the neighbors. People ran out of their houses, not understanding what was happening. Ambulances and police arrived at the scene within minutes, but it was already too late. Jenny was dead. While the girl's body was carefully placed on a stretcher and carried into an ambulance, the city was plunged into shock. Residents of Redding had known each other for many years, but no one could have imagined that such a brutal crime could happen right under their noses. The police immediately began an investigation. Initially, everyone sympathized with Harold, considering him a poor old man who had lost his only loved one. But soon, Detective Alice Murray, assigned to the case, began to have questions. What could have happened in this house to lead to such a terrible outcome? And could someone who seemed so good-natured and calm hide such a dark side of his life? Alice was known for her thorough approach to investigations. She knew how to see what eluded others, and was sure that every crime, no matter how mysterious it may seem, always leaves traces, if you know where to look. From that moment on, the detective's attention was focused on Harold. Her experience and intuition suggested that not everything in this matter was as simple as it seemed at first glance. The next day, the town woke up in a heavy atmosphere of anxiety. Newspapers and local news channels immediately spread the news of Jenny's death. Reports described her as a bright, cheerful girl who could not displease anyone. Her death seemed all the more senseless and cruel. But what really bothered Alice Murray was the shadow that hung over the White House. What secrets were hidden behind its walls? And who really was this old man, whom everyone considered a respectable citizen? These questions became the starting point for her investigation, which would reveal a darker truth than anyone could have imagined. This is how this story began, with shock, horror, and doubt. Ahead of Alice and her team were difficult days and nights filled with the search for answers that could shed light on the dark side of human nature. The first days after the tragedy, Redding was plunged into an atmosphere of deep despondency and bewilderment. The city, which had always seemed calm and safe, was now gripped by fear and suspicion. The murder of a young girl shocked everyone to the core. People whispered about what happened, discussed possible versions, but no one had the slightest idea how this could happen. Meanwhile, Detective Alice Murray got to work. She knew that in investigations of this nature it was important not only to gather evidence, but also to understand how the victim lived his life. Jenny White was young, attractive, and seemed to have no enemies. However, Alice also understood that the true motives for crimes are often hidden behind a seemingly ideal picture. The first thing Alice decided to do was study in detail Jenny's relationships with the people around her. She started, of course, with Harold White. The old man seemed overcome with grief, but something in his behavior alarmed the detective. She noticed that his account of the events of that evening was full of gaps and inconsistencies. Harold claimed that he was at home at the time of the murder, but his testimony about what he was doing constantly changed. Alice decided to conduct a deeper interrogation. During the conversation, she found out that after the death of her parents, Jenny moved in with Harold about a year ago. The two of them lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city. Neighbors described their relationship as very close, but at the same time strange. No one had ever seen Jenny bring friends home or date anyone else. She was with her grandfather almost all the time, which looked unusual for a young girl of her age. Detectives began to examine the house and the area around it, hoping to find at least some clue. The search yielded unexpected results. Many photographs of Jenny were found in Harold's personal room. Some of them were overtly intimate. These findings raised suspicions among Alice and her colleagues that the relationship between grandfather and granddaughter might not be as innocent as it seemed at first glance. However, despite these discoveries, there was no direct evidence against Harold. All they had on their hands was the strange behavior of the old man and the disturbing findings in his house. Alice knew that this was not enough to press charges. She needed more evidence, more information about what was really going on in this house. Alice turned to Jenny's friends and acquaintances, hoping to learn more about her life before moving to her grandfather. In conversations with classmates and neighbors, a picture began to emerge that Jenny felt isolated. She rarely interacted with anyone outside of school, and no one knew about any of her romantic interests. Her life seemed closed and full of secrets. An important witness was Tom Harris, Jenny's classmate, who sometimes saw her outside of school. He told detectives that he once noticed how Jenny and her grandfather acted not like relatives, but like a couple. They held hands and exchanged looks that seemed too close to him for a grandfather and granddaughter. Tom also recalled that a few days before her death, he saw them quarreling in the street. Jenny looked scared and confused, and Harold was irritated and didn't seem to want anyone to see them. Alice began to put the puzzle together in her head. There was clearly something wrong with Jenny and Harold's relationship, but what could lead to murder? The detective continued to search for answers, delving into the dark sides of these people's lives. She knew that revealing the truth would be painful for everyone who knew Jenny and her grandfather, but it was necessary to bring the perpetrator to justice. Days passed, and the city continued to live in anticipation of news of the investigation. People wanted to know the truth, but at the same time they were afraid of it. Alice knew she had a long and difficult job ahead of her, but she was determined to find who was responsible for the young girl's death. After all, every murder is not just a tragedy, but also a mystery that requires resolution. As Alice Murray delved deeper into the investigation, she began to realize that the Jenny White case was much more complicated and dark than she could have imagined. The external picture, which seemed clear at first glance, hid underneath a whole network of secrets that became more and more confusing as they were revealed. After a conversation with Tom Harris, Alice realized that the key to the solution lay in the White House itself. Suspicions that the relationship between Harold and Jenny may have been more than just familial have now become the main focus of the investigation. Detectives conducted a second search of the house, this time paying special attention to Jenny's personal belongings and her diaries. In Jenny's room, they found a diary hidden in her desk drawer. The pages of the diary were filled with neat handwriting that reflected her inner experiences and emotions. As Alice read through her diary, it became increasingly clear that Jenny lived in constant fear and tension. She often wrote about how difficult it was for her to live with her grandfather, who, according to her, began to control her life down to the smallest detail. In one of the entries, she even mentioned that her grandfather sometimes acted as if she were his wife and not his granddaughter. These recordings shocked detectives. They began to suspect that Harold might have feelings for his granddaughter that went beyond normal family relationships. However, the evidence was still not enough to bring formal charges. Alice knew that if they went forward with these accusations too early, they could not only ruin Harold's reputation, but also lose the opportunity to bring the case to trial. Detectives decided to go further and delve into Harold's past. They examined his financial and medical records, looking for anything that could confirm their suspicions. It was soon discovered that Harold had consulted a psychologist several times, although he never mentioned this to the police. These records showed that Harold had suffered from depression and loneliness since the death of his wife several years earlier. He described his granddaughter as the only light in his life, but the psychologist mentioned his unusual attachments and emotional dependence, which made Alice even more worried. Meanwhile, Alice decided to talk to Harold's neighbors, trying to gather more evidence. Neighbor Martha Green, who had already experienced the shock of finding Jenny's body, said that she had always found Harold somewhat strange. She noticed that he avoided socializing with other people and rarely left the house unless he accompanied Jenny. Martha remembered the time she saw them in the park, where Jenny looked depressed and Harold constantly whispered something in her ear. These observations increased Alice's suspicions that Harold was trying to isolate Jenny from the outside world. However, the most alarming thing was that the neighbor had heard quarrels coming from their house recently. At night, a few days before the tragedy, Marta heard loud screams and the sounds of broken dishes, but did not attach any importance to this, thinking that it was just a domestic quarrel. Now she realized that she could have witnessed something much more serious. Alice also approached Jenny's school teachers to gain insight into her behavior and emotional state at school. Teachers described her as a quiet and diligent student, but noticed that recently she had become more withdrawn and often missed classes. Classmates confirmed that Jenny often came to school depressed and tired. Although she did not tell anyone about her problems at home, detectives began to piece together a picture. Jenny was locked in a psychological trap created by her grandfather. Harold, lonely and desperate, saw in his granddaughter something more than just a loved one. His feelings gradually turned into obsessive attachment, which may have led to tragedy. However, Alice understood that, despite all the evidence and testimony, it would not be easy to prove Harold's guilt. It was necessary to find concrete evidence that could convince the court of his involvement in the murder. Detectives continued to examine Jenny and Harold's belongings and collected additional evidence from anyone who might know something. Days passed and tension in the city grew. Reading residents continued to whisper and speculate, but no one could have imagined how grim the details of this case would turn out to be. Alice and her team worked almost non-stop, knowing that time was against them. If they can't find enough evidence to charge Harold, this case may go unsolved. With each new discovery, the atmosphere around the case thickened. Alice felt that she was getting closer to the truth, but she knew that it would be even darker than all the assumptions. Jenny's murder was not just a crime, but a tragedy in which love, loneliness, and madness were intertwined. And unraveling this knot was a task that required maximum concentration and patience. The investigation continued, and the tension surrounding the Jenny White case grew every day. Alice Murray and her team realized that they were on the verge of revealing a terrible truth, but they were missing the last thread that would connect all the evidence into one immutable picture. The city of Reading lived in anticipation of an answer, and in this anticipation lurked a shadow of fear. What if the truth could never be revealed? Meanwhile, a slow and painful split was beginning in the White household. Harold White, who initially seemed like a miserable old man who had lost his granddaughter, was now under the scrutiny of the police and the entire city. People who had previously treated him with respect now avoided his gaze. Even his closest friends began to distance themselves, fearing that something dark was hiding behind his appearance. During the interrogations, Alice found out that behind the facade of a friendly and caring grandfather, there was something more hidden. Harold became increasingly nervous, his statements were confused, and he often fell silent in the middle of a sentence, as if afraid to say too much. Every day he became more and more withdrawn into himself, as if realizing that his secrets were gradually becoming apparent. But the most shocking thing was a new revelation that came from Tom Harris, Jenny's classmate. During the next interrogation, Tom remembered something important. He admitted that he saw Jenny talking to someone in her backyard a few days before her death. This conversation was clearly tense, and Tom even heard snatches of phrases that made him tense. He heard Jenny say something like, "I can't do this anymore," to which her interlocutor responded in a dull and threatening manner. "You must obey." Tom did not see the interlocutor's face, but was sure that it was a man, and judging by his voice, older than her. This confession added fuel to the fire. Now Alice and her team began to realize that there was more to the relationship between Jenny and her grandfather than just obsessive affection. It has been suggested that Harold may have forced his granddaughter to submit to his will, perhaps by threatening or manipulating her. But what exactly was the reason for this pressure remained unclear. Trying to find an answer, Alice decided to turn to Martha Green, the White's neighbor again. Martha, who had been helping the investigation from the very beginning, now remembered another detail that had previously seemed insignificant. A few days before Jenny's death, she saw Harold and Jenny discussing something on the veranda. They spoke quietly, but Martha noticed how Harold's face was tense and Jenny looked scared. At the time, she thought it was just a family dispute, but now she realized it could be something much more serious. Alice began to consider a new version. Perhaps Jenny was trying to free herself from the influence of her grandfather, and he, in turn, could not come to terms with this, and tried to maintain control over her at any cost. This would explain both the tense conversations and the fear that Jenny expressed in her diary. But if this is so, then what exactly led to the tragedy? An important twist was the discovery of hidden letters that Jenny kept under her mattress. In them, she shared her experiences and fears, describing her life with her grandfather as a golden cage. She wrote that she felt locked in, that Harold constantly watched her every move, controlled her communications, and even tried to limit her exits from the house. These letters were permeated with despair and the desire to break free. Alice knew they now had the key to understanding Harold's motivation. He was obsessed with his granddaughter to the point that he perceived her as property that needed to be controlled and protected from the outside world. He may not have even realized how destructive his actions were, but it became an unbearable burden for Jenny. Now the team of detectives had a task: to prove that it was Harold who was behind Jenny's murder. They knew they couldn't simply accuse him based on suspicion and guesswork. They needed solid evidence that could convince the court of his guilt. However, Alice and her team faced a new problem. Harold, feeling that clouds were gathering around him, began to actively defend himself. He hired a lawyer who immediately stated that his client was not guilty and that the police were trying to pin the blame on him in order to close the case as quickly as possible. Harold spoke to reporters, portraying himself as an innocent victim, deprived of his granddaughter, and now also subjected to unfair accusations. Alice understood that the investigation was now moving into a new phase, the phase of confrontation. She knew that every step had to be carefully thought out so as not to give Harold and his lawyer the slightest chance of acquittal. She needed more evidence that could finally destroy the image of the respectable old man that Harold was trying to preserve. The investigation continued, and tensions around the case reached their climax. Alice Murray and her team realized that every mistake could lead to the killer remaining free. Pressure from the public and the media was mounting, and everyone expected that the case was about to be solved. But Alice understood that without irrefutable evidence, they would not be able to convince the court of Harold White's guilt. One morning, as Alice was getting ready for work, she received a call from a medical examiner who was conducting further examination of Jenny's body. He reported that he had discovered something important: a piece of tissue stuck under the girl's nails. This fragment was so small that it was not noticed upon initial inspection, but upon closer analysis it was revealed that it was part of the fabric from which the shirt was made. The expert also noted that Jenny had traces of skin tags under her fingernails, indicating that she had struggled with her attacker before she died. Alice immediately contacted the team and they began checking all of Harold's shirts. It soon became clear that one of the shirts he was wearing on the day of his granddaughter's death had a tear in the sleeve that matched the piece of fabric found. Moreover, DNA analysis of the epithelium under Jenny's fingernails confirmed that it was Harold. This was the decisive evidence that allowed all the pieces of the puzzle to fit together. Alice knew she now had enough evidence to charge Harold. But before doing this, she decided to conduct one last interrogation to try to get a confession out of him. Harold did not expect such a turn of events. He remained confident during interrogations, claiming that his granddaughter was killed by someone else, and he was the victim of an unfair accusation. But when he was presented with the DNA results and a piece of tissue, his confidence began to fade. At first, Harold tried to explain it away as an accident, claiming that the tear in his shirt could have appeared on any other day, and the DNA on Jenny's body was there because he hugged her often. However, Alice understood that this was just an attempt to delay time and confuse the investigation. She pressed Harold, asking direct questions and reminding him that there was enough evidence against him for the court to find him guilty. Under pressure from evidence and questions, Harold began to crack. His face turned pale. His hands trembled. He became more and more withdrawn into himself, and then suddenly he burst into tears. This was the moment Alice had been waiting for. She knew there was more behind those tears than just grief. Harold began to speak. At first, these were fragmentary phrases, then his words became more coherent. He admitted that things had indeed been tense between him and Jenny in recent months. He described how his feelings of loneliness and need for a loved one gradually turned into a painful attachment to his granddaughter. He wanted to protect her from the outside world which he believed could harm her. But Jenny began to pull away, to protest his control, and it was driving him crazy. On that fateful day, they quarreled again. Jenny wanted to leave home and live on her own to gain more freedom. Harold couldn't let that happen. In a fit of rage, he grabbed her, trying to force her to stay. She struggled, screamed, tried to break free, and at that moment he lost control of himself. He didn't remember how it happened, but at some point he hit her. Jenny fell and hit her head on a stone in the garden. Panic gripped him and he didn't know what to do. In desperation, he decided to hide the body, but, unable to cope with this, he left it among the bushes. Harold's confession was recorded on video, and this was the final nail in the coffin of his defense. He realized that he could no longer hide the truth. His attempt to protect his granddaughter turned into a terrible crime that took her life. Alice saw before her not just a killer, but a man who was broken by his own despair and loneliness. Following his confession, Harold was arrested and taken to prison to await trial. The city of Reading was shocked by this turn of events. People who once respected Harold now saw him as a monster who had destroyed the life of a young girl. But for Alice Murray, it was not just about punishment. It was also about finding justice for Jenny. Alice understood that this incident would stay with her for the rest of her life. He showed her how fragile human relationships are and how easily one can cross the line beyond which madness begins. However, she also knew that despite the severity of what had happened, her work had borne fruit. The truth had been revealed, and the killer had been caught. The day of judgment has arrived. Everyone involved in the Jenny White case gathered in the small Reading County Courthouse. Local residents, reporters, friends, and family acquaintances all came to hear the verdict that would put an end to this tragic story. The hall was filled to capacity, and every breath, every movement was felt as part of a large and dark drama playing out before their eyes. Harold White looked depressed and exhausted. He was no longer the confident old man his neighbors knew him to be. His face was covered with a network of wrinkles. His eyes were red and puffy from crying, and his shoulders were slumped under the weight of guilt that he could no longer deny. Harold knew that his confession was a fatal step that determined his fate, but deep down he may have felt relief. There was no more lying, hiding, and pretending. The trial was short, as Harold's confession and the evidence collected left no doubt about his guilt. The prosecutor briefly presented all the evidence to the court, from the testimony of witnesses to the results of the forensic examination. Particular attention was paid to Jenny's emotional state, which, as it turned out, was undermined due to constant pressure and control from her grandfather. The defense lawyer tried to reduce the sentence, citing Harold's advanced age, his psychological state, and the desperation in which he was. He argued that Harold was not a cold-blooded killer, but just a man broken by loneliness and suffering. He asked the court to show mercy, given the difficult circumstances that led to the tragedy. However, the court could not ignore the fact that Harold took the life of a young girl who was just beginning to live. Jenny White was an innocent victim, and her death shocked the entire city. The judge, after weighing all the arguments, rendered a verdict. Harold White was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, a heavy silence hung in the courtroom. Harold simply nodded without looking up. He knew that this sentence was inevitable. His life was destroyed, as were the lives of those around him. Now he had to spend his remaining years in prison, away from the people and memories that haunted him. Alice Murray, who watched the process, felt both satisfaction and sadness. She knew that justice had been served, but that would not bring Jenny back to life. For Alice, this case became a lesson that she will remember forever. It showed her how complex human relationships are, and how easily the line between love and obsession, between caring and control, can be crossed. After the trial, life in Reading gradually began to return to normal. But the city will never be the same. The story of Jenny White and her tragic fate left an indelible mark on the hearts of its residents. Local newspapers discussed this matter for a long time, and in every home, in every family, they talked about how important it was to maintain a balance between personal freedom and family ties. It was time for Alice and her team to move on and take on new things. But they knew that this story would stay with them for a long time. Jenny White, her life and death became a symbol of how fragile human nature is and how important it is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. This was not just another case in their practice. It was a challenge that they accepted and were able to overcome, albeit at the cost of enormous effort and emotional cost. Harold White was sent to prison, where he would spend the rest of his days reflecting on his actions. But perhaps the most severe punishment for him is the realization that he, without meaning to, caused the death of the only person close to him. The story ended, but the questions it raised remained. What motivates people to do such things? How can we prevent similar tragedies in the future? These questions will haunt the minds of those who witnessed this case for a long time. But the most important thing is that justice has prevailed, and the memory of Jenny White will live in the hearts of people as a reminder of how important it is to value life and freedom and how easily it can all be lost.